All right, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. This is our third presentation capping off our series on Urban Heat Island in Philadelphia. This is a bunch of information, so the architects on the call will be very excited to hear that you're going to be getting 1.5 CEUs tonight and HSW. Got the good stuff. Not going to read this because we're going to hear all about it in the next few slides. I would like to do a land acknowledgement. We would like to acknowledge that the Center for Architecture stands on ground formerly inhabited by the Lenni Lenape people of Lenape, Hoking, and the Patuxent, Delaware Bay. These are the people who, during the 1680s, negotiated with William Penn to facilitate the founding of the colony of Pennsylvania. Their descendants today include the Delaware Tribe and Delaware Nation of Oklahoma, the Nanticoke Lenni Lenape, Ramapough Lenape, and Powhatan Lenape of New Jersey, and the Munshee Delaware of Ontario, quoted from the Association of Native Alumni at the University of Pennsylvania. Committee on the Environment and Urban Design Committee collaborated on this year to discuss urban heat island, redlining, and gentrification. In part one, Victoria Martine and Elizabeth May shared their project from Jefferson University College of Architecture and the Built Environment. Here's a quick recap of urban heat island effect. Urbanized areas that experience higher temperatures than outlying areas. Structures such as buildings, roads, and other infrastructure absorb and re-emit the sun's heat more than natural landscapes such as forests and water. Sorry, the slide is being covered by... Okay. And re-emit the sun's heat more than natural landscapes such as forests and water bodies. Urban areas where these structures are highly concentrated and greenery is limited become islands of higher temperatures relative to outlying areas. Daytime temperatures in urban areas are about 1 to 7 degrees higher than temperatures in outlying areas, and nighttime temperatures are about 2 to 5 degrees higher, from the US EPA. Redlining was the racist practice by which banks intentionally disinvested in neighborhoods primarily consisting of people of color. They drew literal red lines on maps around these neighborhoods, as you can see in the map. Gentrification is an influx of investment and new middle-income residents into a recently disinvested central city neighborhood that has the effect of displacing existing lower-income residents, businesses, and neighborhood culture. Elizabeth and Victoria's GIS research revealed particularly heat-vulnerable neighborhoods of Philadelphia, outlined in black. You can see the lingering impacts of redlining leading to higher heat risk. In our second event, we explored how urban heat island mitigation can exacerbate displacement, a symptom of gentrification. There is a link between green space and decreased land surface temperatures. This is a well-studied phenomenon. This particular one was done in Beijing. Most people on the call are very familiar with the High Line in New York City. It is a green space that has caused property values to skyrocket in its near vicinity. In summary, green space creation can lead to rising real estate value, can lead to rising real estate taxes, can lead to rising rent, and then this can cause displacement of people in neighborhoods. Isaac Guan of Urban Partners shared his research on how the rail park in Philadelphia has had a similar impact on neighboring land. So you can see the red, 20% premium, all the way down to 3% premium, which are quite a few blocks away. Sarah Young of Sojourner Consulting gave us a deep dive into how to mitigate the impacts of gentrification and displacement. For example, I'm not going to go through all of these line items, but just to pick a few. Language access is not simply a translated copy of information. Where do immigrants get their information from? It might be different from people who are native speakers. Is the technical jargon something they will actually understand? Even if you do a direct translation of something, they're not necessarily going to understand it. AAPI gentrification is often ignored because Asians are typically seen as the well-earning model minority, and this is not helping the conversation because that's not necessarily true. Ongoing lessons, how do we create true partnerships which take time, strategy, and understanding of shared priorities and goals. So up next, we have two folks from the City of Philadelphia Office of Sustainability. Cheyenne Flores is the Residential Climate Mitigation Specialist for the City of Philadelphia Office of Sustainability. Flores leads community-based, data-driven heat resilience and residential energy equity initiatives, including Beat the Heat Hunting Park. Korin Tangtrakul is the Program Manager for Place-Based Initiatives in the City of Philadelphia's Office of Sustainability. She works closely with communities disproportionately impacted by climate change to develop a strategy for climate resilience. Prior to this position, she was the Sustainability Manager for the Sustainable Water Resource Engineering Lab at Drexel. So take it away.
Okay, let's see. How can I tell if I'm visible? Okay. Let me just move this around. Okay, now I can see myself. Oh, that's brutal. Okay. So for those in person and for those online, please let me know if you cannot hear me online, by the way. I will just refer to the chat. I'm Cheyenne. I'm going to be sharing with you some of the work that we do at the Office of Sustainability, particular to heat resilience in Philadelphia. Oh, sorry. Oh. Okay, so let's get ourselves in the mindset of summer. It's definitely still warm outside, but it is kind of cooling down, right? So let's think about, what does it feel like in the summertime? What comes to your mind? For those of you who are in person, if you want to call out anything that comes to mind. For anyone online, you can just use the chat. Normally I have a whole thing that we use, but since we're doing a hybrid, just think about what's something that comes to mind for you when it's really hot. For me, it's definitely sweat. Anything else? I'm doing so right now. Anyone want to call out? Discomfort, yes, and that's the one we'll think about. Sunscreen, the smell of sunscreen, right? It's my favorite. So with that in mind, right, we think about climate change is kind of a dirty word, right? It's going to exacerbate discomfort, right? Probably a lot of sweating, possibly a lot of sunscreen, right? So we know that it's continuing to get hotter. In June of 2021, which is even outdated, we are just continuing to break records. Every single summer we break records. Every single month of every single summer has broken a record for that month. So 2023 is on track to exceed this year's record. We're looking at, as many, over 50 days of temperatures that are above 95 degrees. So super, super hot a lot of the time, right? We have about 3 to 5 days of that now. And then we have, projections that show us that it's also going to increase in precipitation in the form of mostly snow, actually, but also rain. And then we also know that PA has one of the highest flooding rates in the country. So flooding and heat are going to be our main factors, both of which have risen astronomically. So we just talked about this, but we know that not every neighborhood experiences climate risk the same way, right? That's part of the problem with climate change and equity, is that there are differences in experience, first of all, from the individual level, then the household level, the community level, and we can go out from there, right? So we know that residents of color, local income residents are more at risk in Philadelphia. They're experiencing disproportionate exposure to heat specifically, and also flooding. Corin's going to talk even more about that on our work in Eastwick in a bit. And we know that actually in Philly, some neighborhoods can be 22 degrees hotter than others, so that's very, very significant. 3 or 4 degrees is something you feel in terms of sweating, for example. We talked about redlining, right? A legacy of disinvesting from and abusing marginalizing BIPOC communities. And that's contributed to an aging housing stock, which makes us hotter. Something else that an aging housing stock does, and a disproportionate exposure to climate-related risks, is it increases energy burden, which is a major barrier for people, because when you have to pay more for your housing costs, including your utilities or your energy, you are unable to use that money elsewhere, right? We know we have a really high poverty rate in this city, so our energy burden in this city is 86% higher than the national average. It's really high. What that means is that we're paying more for our energy bills than the average when it comes down to kind of a calculation, which is just takes into account your, basically your housing costs. So yeah, we have many people who are housing cost burdened specifically with energy, and we need that, right? You need it to stay cool, you need it to stay warm, you need it to stay healthy and safe inside your home. And again, this is also being disproportionately experienced by lower income residents of color. So, some of the risk factors of heat vulnerability we can look at from 3 different ways. There's being exposed to it, so being out in the sun, right? So people who work outside, people who are experiencing homelessness, athletes. Then we have the ability to find and seek refuge from heat. So if you live alone, that's gonna be really hard. If you're homebound, that's gonna be really hard. Then we have biological factors that go into it. So older adults, pregnant people, for example, right? So there's many ways to experience heat, and there are many things that go into those risk factors when it comes to planning. Looking at planning, the way that we respond to climate change can be split into 3 different pieces, and I'm sure you're very familiar with this, but I always like to go through it with people. So we have mitigation, right? So it's taking an action to reduce, to mitigate, right? Then we have adaptation, so we change or adapt to understand, this risk is here, we have to change to it, right? That's like a seawall as an example. Then we have a combo. So for example, here we see we put a bunch of greenery. The mitigation aspect of that is that it is, absorbing, well, honestly, you can really go far with that, so I won't even dive into it, but that's a combination of both of those. Oh, that worked. And then lastly, you have community resiliency. That is absolutely another way that we respond to climate risks. So when we look at community resiliency, what I mean by that is we have something called community cohesion, the level of closeness between a group, right? If you're really tight with your community, you guys are gonna show up for each other, right? If you think about Hurricane Ida, for example, maybe you were in a neighborhood that was really hard hit. Were your neighbors outside with you? Were they, chopping down the tree that was blocking X's driveway or whatever, right? Helping each other deal with a car that was stuck, for example. Those are all kind of examples of community cohesion and community resiliency. And we can actually look at a case study of a 1995 Chicago heat wave. We have 2 different communities here, Little Village and North Lawndale. And they both had very similar story on paper, but they responded really differently to that heat wave. Many people died in North Lawndale because they experienced a lot of marginalization. And then you have Little Village. They were really tight, really close. They had a lot of population density, and they had a really low death rate, for example, right? It's just one of the things we can see. So looking back at Philly, one of the things that we decided to do was launch a pilot into how we can begin to understand how to plan from a community perspective. How can we kind of flip the narrative so that we as the city are sitting in the back seat providing resources and guidance, while the community that is being worked with, or the greater Philadelphia community, is providing leadership, is essentially steering the ship, right? And so the way that we decided to do this, considering all of this heat equity issues, was with heat. So we looked at one of the hottest neighborhoods in Philadelphia, which is Hunting Park. It's a fabulous neighborhood. It's one of my favorite places in the city. And we worked with a couple of community organizations there. The main things that we did were, we had a heat team of community residents. We had heat ambassadors who were paid community residents. You can see them in the upper right. We did a heat survey. So we wanted to ask folks, is this something you care about? Is this something you're struggling with? How do you deal with heat? What do you do in order to stay cool in the summer? What's it like for your energy bills? And then we did a heat design workshop where we asked folks, tell us, like, where do you go to stay cool? Where do you go, you know, outside to stay cool? Where's a safe zone? Where's a danger zone? Where do you like to go with your kids in the summertime? And the overall goal of this was to, yes, increase heat resiliency, but it was also to center equity and justice in a planning process and to discover how we can do that adequately as a pilot. So on the right side, these are our equity principles that we still use now. So when working with communities, we make sure to first have the needs voiced, right? So we need to hear what people need or we won't be able to help them, right? We need to acknowledge their identity. We need to shift the power, right? That's a continuous effort of shifting the power out from under us in the city and positions of power to community organizations, community individuals. We need to uplift storytelling as data. It's not always about the numbers, right? It's also about what folks say that they're dealing with and making sure to uplift that and honor that as real hard data that we can work with. And then we need to build relationships. That's always something. If you have ever worked with a government or if you have any experience with government, you know that the relationships are not always solid. So it's something we're always working on. Then what did it look like to implement it, right? So you can see these are pictures all from the implementation from the past 2 years, 2020 and 2021. Now I'll give you a fair warning in that the kind of finding of that first pilot was a plan. It was a big plan. Lots of cool stuff in it. One of them was to build a community cooling center network, right? So we started that process. We were gung-ho. Then COVID hit. And it was just like, yeah, bring people inside to random spaces. Like, no, it didn't make sense anymore. So instead, we decided to utilize the grant funds that we had, and we decided to do a air conditioner giveaway. I think it was at that time that it became more and more obvious that, one, people need things inside their homes. That's a basic thing, right? Two, it was a crisis response. So, you know, what do you do in a crisis response? You give stuff away, right? You find all the resources you can, you bring all the manpower on that you can, the human power, and you give stuff away. And so that kind of like changed definitely where we were going with this project. But we kept the core, right? So we did energy efficiency workshops, heat safety workshops. We trained our heat ambassadors. We continue to have our heat ambassadors. We continue to have our steering committee of community residents. Our heat ambassadors were paid. We did a bunch of activities, including a heat wave activity that we'll do for like a second today. And then we did a cooling resource giveaway. So we gave away air conditioners, fans, and we gave away cool kits, which had like info, how to stay cool, how to stay safe, where you can go to sit and chill out somewhere, mini fans, like those spritzer fans, water, electrolyte tablets, people love those. And then we also had community meetings. So we had community meetings almost every week to steer the project, figure out what to do next. There were so many issues that went wrong. My favorite thing about this is that I put one picture upside down and most people never notice it. So I'm going to hand it over to Korin, who's going to walk up here, and she's going to talk about a tangential project.
Thanks, Chai. Yes, so as Sophia mentioned in the introduction, before I started with the Office of Sustainability, I was working for Drexel University in the Sustainable Water Resource Engineering Lab. So I'm going to start with my former employee of Drexel hat on and talk about this project that we did in coordination with the Office of Sustainability. And then I'll talk a little bit about my work now in the Office of Sustainability and how it's building off of the Beat the Heat work that Chai has been involved in Hunting Park. So at Drexel, I was the sustainability manager for this group called the Sustainable Water Resource Engineering Lab. And water resources is in the name. We were really focused on green infrastructure and stormwater management and trying to better understand how to optimize green infrastructure to capture as much water as possible. But as we started to see the impacts of climate change, we were really feeling like we needed to shift focus to not focus as much on green infrastructure itself, but more on flood resilience and climate resilience. And then that really got us thinking also about heat, about climate change generally, and about heat and flooding resilience together. So when the pandemic hit and we were seeing projections from NOAA that it was going to be an abnormally hot summer, which now that I think about is like, as Shai said, that's every summer now, but in 2020, as like the pandemic hit, we're like, it's gonna be a really hot summer. We were really feeling really anxious about all of these public air-conditioned spaces that were gonna be closed, like libraries, cooling centers, public pools are gonna be closed. And knowing the Beat the Heat work that the Office of Sustainability was working on, we had read that these communities, particularly Hunting Park, people tend to stay home when it's hot. And so we came to the realization that we should be thinking about like community level or block level heat resilience, and thinking about how to keep folks cool where they live and not necessarily in these at these other spaces like cooling centers, especially if they were going to be closed. So we wanted to kind of merge these different fields that we had been thinking about green infrastructure and greening to achieve neighborhood cooling. So we actually at the time reached out to Shai and the Office of Sustainability to see where Beat the Heat had left off, or where they were at the time, and if there was opportunity to explore some neighborhood scale cooling techniques with our lab. And then Shai introduced us to Esperanza, one of the community partners there, and that's kind of where this project took off. So I'm actually going to share a story map that I created. This is a screenshot of it, Heat in Hunting Park. And for any GIS nerds here on the Zoom, these story maps are part of an ArcGIS suite, and I find to be them like really helpful storytelling tools, particular for people that love maps like me. It combines different types of media to help tell a pretty effective story. And I created this so that our partners would have a resource that they could point people to, instead of like a slide deck that, typically we present at a conference and we have slides that we share, but there's a lot of narrative that gets lost in the slides. So I thought a story map would be a helpful way to just kind of like tell the story without, having to sit through a presentation. I don't think anybody's actually using a story map though, so it wasn't super effective at sharing, making it a tool that can be shared. But it's here for anybody to reference to if they want to in the future. So let's see, is this going to work? Okay. It's a little laggy, but I think that'll be okay. So this story map, it starts with a lot of stuff that we've already talked about. So I'm going to kind of scroll through the introduction here. Talks about climate change. It's getting hotter. It's going to keep getting hotter. We're going to have more heat waves of longer duration. Exposure to heat is not just uncomfortable, but it can also be have very negative consequences on our physical and mental health. Talk about urban heat island, how it's worse in the cities, and not only worse in the cities, but in particular portions of the city because of legacies of systemic racism, such as redlining. And we've already seen these maps of how redlining and heat vulnerability correlate pretty strongly. One tool that I find really fun with these story maps is this side-by-side feature. So go back to when we were thinking about a really hot day and how you're feeling on a really hot day. And if you're on a block like this, you might really appreciate the shade that you're given by the trees on this block. But on a parallel block just 2 streets away is another block that has no trees. And it's not that this block never had trees. You can actually see that there were some portions of the curb that were cut out where there were trees before, but were not maintained or for whatever reason are not there any longer. And so you can just imagine being on this block on a very hot day and feeling very different than if you were on this block, comfort-wise from heat. So these are 2 blocks in Hunting Park that are just 2 streets from each other. So you can even see the disparate impacts of disinvestment, even from block to block. So we talk then in the story map about why Hunting Park, our partnership with the Office of of Sustainability and Esperanza. And then what we ended up doing in 2020 was starting a pilot program that summer with this one block in Hunting Park that had a particularly active block captain that was very interested and engaged in working with us on some cooling strategies in her neighborhood, on her block actually. So we worked just on one block this year, working on a few different strategies. And so as like a research lab, we really wanted to explore different ways to do cooling at the neighborhood level. We were thinking of different mechanisms like greening. There were already some trees at the end of the block. We were thinking about water and pavement wetting. We've seen in other countries, I think in Japan, there's a practice of wetting the pavement, and the evaporation of the water over time helps cool that block down. So we were thinking of strategies like that. We were thinking of strategies that would just increase shade on the block. We had thought about like draping canopies over the block, but after some engagement with the community members, we had a lot of meetings with the block captain and with residents on the block to hear like what kind of strategies they were interested in, what types of things they liked. We worked with an architect to come up with this one design that seemed to fit what we were hearing. We were hearing that residents didn't really have a place to sit on the block, and that they would really like a place to sit, and that they would like some shade. The canopy idea didn't quite work because it would have to attach to houses, and we weren't sure if we could like structurally attach something to houses, and if like a hurricane came by, what would that do to the homes if there were these like pieces of fabric that were tied or that were linked to their homes. And also clearance for delivery trucks coming through we had to keep in mind. So we ended up with these little kind of modular little units that we call shade structures or cooling bench. We've called them multiple things, cooling benches, shade structures, but it includes a little bench here and an umbrella attachment so that you have shade, you have a place to sit, and you have a little bit of green here. And we also had handed out some sprinklers to the block as well for kids to play in and to help cool through that pavement wetting technique. Originally, we had thought we would kind of break the block up into 3 different like segments and have like a green section, a water section, a shade section, and then a control, and then we could kind of monitor the temperature differences throughout the block. It turns out everybody just wanted a bench, so we gave benches to the whole block and didn't really do the segments of different interventions. We kind of scrapped that idea and just gave out these benches. And another component of the project was job creation. We were hearing that a lot of residents, particularly in North Philly, had lost their jobs because of COVID. And so we wanted to also provide an employment opportunity. So we were able to hire the block captain to help with the community engagement perspective components. And then we were also able to hire some people on the block to help with building the structures themselves. So that was our pilot year. We were trialing a lot of different things. We were trialing different like temperature monitoring and things, but it was such a short summer and so much going on that we really just called this a pilot, and we wanted to kind of like perfect this model and try to kind of build from there. So the next year we this all was funded by William Penn Foundation, by the way. So the next year we got more funding from William Penn to kind of expand and do more of these benches. We did some of the sprinklers, but it really turned out that the benches were what people wanted and what we thought would be the most impactful. So we expanded our employment program. We hired a bunch of people in the early stages of the summer to help with the construction and implementation of these benches. We set up a warehouse at Esperanza for building and deploying them. And then you can see here, so we expanded to 5 more blocks in the second year in 2021. So this is where we had our first pilot block on Marshall Street, and then we expanded to these other blocks that are in blue here. And as we were expanding to other blocks, we also wanted to install more sensors to see how effective these benches were for cooling, or what other ways we were seeing cooling happening in the neighborhood. So we installed stationary temperature well, actually, I'll say we did a few different things to try to evaluate the effectiveness. We installed stationary sensors throughout the neighborhood. We also had a few campaigns of mobile sensors where people walked through the neighborhood with a sensor to see block by block differences. And then we also did a survey to see how residents felt and what they liked or didn't like about the structures and about the whole program. So for the stationary sensors, we had them throughout the neighborhood. We had them in this park, Hunting Park, which actually is a huge park. And then we had them on some streets that had the planters and some streets that did not have the benches, not the planters, sorry, the benches. I'm gonna kind of gloss through this part. Long story short, our placement of the sensors was not ideal, and the data that we got was like not great. I was able to get data for like 1 week during the hottest week of 2021. But what we found is that these little peaks here, which are on, the blue are on the blocks that had the shade structures, the yellow is on blocks without the shade structures, and the green were the stationary sensors that were in the parks. So you can see these peaks here on the blocks that had the shade structures, which we weren't expecting you would want to see that the shade structures were making it cooler. But it turns out that we were putting the sensors in a sunny spot, and so they were not catching what it felt like in shade. They were catching what it felt like in the sun. And so that was kind of a duh moment for us. That's like, you know, these are tiny modular systems. They're really creating cooling when you're sitting underneath them. As soon as you step out from underneath these shade structures, you're not cool anymore. It's a little obvious now. So, you know, we weren't really achieving block level cooling. We're just creating like one cool spot for people to sit. But what I did like to see about this data is the difference between the park and the street, which is the yellow and the blue. So in the park here, you can see, the peak temperatures are very different, 108 degrees Fahrenheit to 95 degrees Fahrenheit during the daytime, and at nighttime, even a 3-degree temperature difference, which is pretty significant. So it's helpful to see, even just like a block away from the park, how different it is temperature-wise when you're on the streets. This is just the averages of the data, slightly cooler in the parks. And then the other part of data collection was collecting temperature data throughout the neighborhood using mobile sensors. And we had some incredible help from Esperanza and some civic scientists that they hired over the summer that were residents of the neighborhood. So we went out for a few days. This was the day that had the most legible data, I'll say. Other days were like a little bit too windy. It was hard to really see anything. This was a still very hot day, August 13th, middle of the heat wave, 3 p.m. And so you can see the redder colors are the hotter days, the hotter temperatures. The yellow are cooler, and you can see just on block to block level how different some of these blocks are. So you can see this whole street here is like a little bit cooler than this street here. This is 5th Street, which is a very high traffic, no trees street. So I overlaid this with some other information. I put trees on top of this map so you can see where there's this cluster of trees here that seems to be making a huge impact on the temperature felt on this block. North 5th Street, again, no trees here. These pockets where there's no trees, you can see a big difference in the temperature. This part is also in a park. The trees don't show up in Hunting Park, but there are a lot of trees in Hunting Park. It's just not on this particular data set that I had. Another thing I was interested in looking at were fire hydrants. That day, there were quite a few fire hydrants that were open that people were using for keeping cool, and that's what seems to be creating this little cool spot here, these fire hydrants that were open. I can't tell what street this is off the top of my head, but that seemed to be really having an impact on the heat on these blocks. And then the last piece that we did was interviewing people that received the shade structures and seeing what their reactions were to the project and if it was making an impact on their block. So this was the part of the study that seemed like it was having the biggest impact was actually the social cohesion that this project seemed to really bring about. Of course, I picked this picture even though there's nobody on it, but you can see the visual impact that the umbrellas have. We had picked different colors, or let residents pick which umbrella color they wanted, and it had a really nice visual impact on the block. But more so than, you know, we weren't really showing much difference in bringing down temperatures. We weren't really seeing a huge impact on actually bringing down the heat. But from the surveys that we did, we were hearing overwhelming positive feedback about just having a place to sit, feeling like they were like cared for or thought of. They got this project, they got these benches for free from us, and they like felt cared for. And then this also became an opportunity for Esperanza to also talk about different heat initiatives. So they, Esperanza for years has been working on getting more trees planted in the neighborhood. But after this project, because they had so many more touch points with residents, they were able to increase how many applications they were getting for street trees by a significant, I don't know exactly how many more applications they got, but they noticed a huge uptick in applications for street trees after this project. And also they made really fun decorations, and people seem to have a lot of fun kind of customizing them and making them something of their own. So, you know, back to what Shai was saying before about social cohesion, that seemed like such a bigger impact, the social cohesion, than the actual heat reduction. So these are just some quotes from folks, and then that's basically the end of my story map. So I'm going to go back to the presentation and kind of shift gears into what I'm working on now. Resume slideshow. Okay, great. Cool. Okay, so so I joined the Office of Sustainability in April of this year, but even though I've left Drexel, they are still working on this heat initiative, and they have expanded to start looking at other neighborhoods. They've done a few more blocks in Hunting Park. We've learned from our mistakes with the sensors, and they have implemented other types of sensors that can kind of account for different, the angle of the sun and solar radiation to get a more accurate picture of what heat is felt like on the ground. So they are continuing that work. There also was a campaign over the summer. So NOAA annually awards cities throughout the US to participate in this urban heat island mapping campaign, where they as a NOAA equip cities with a bunch of sensors, and then on one day, everybody goes out and takes readings throughout the city. So this year, Philadelphia was one of the cities that got this opportunity. So they pick one clear, hot summer day, I think today's was July 30th, and do a scan of the entire city. They do a snapshot of heat and air quality so that they can compare citywide what heat and air quality look like on that one day. So what the Academy of Natural Sciences, who was the awardee of this campaign, the Academy of Natural Sciences broke up the city into like 10 different sections. They mounted sensors on cars, and then they had people drive throughout those sections at 3 times throughout the day, at 6 a.m., at 3 p.m., and at 7 p.m. And so when we get we don't have the data from that yet, but when we get it, it will show kind of the variation of heat and air quality throughout the city, as well as variation throughout the day. And they don't drive every block. They get representative samples, and then NOAA kind of interpolates those results to create a raster grid of heat variation through the city. So it wasn't like somebody was driving up and down every single block. It was just a portion of that section. So results for that, I think, will be coming out in October, so you can keep your eye on that. And then I also wanted to highlight something else that the city's been working on. The Department of Parks and Recreation has been developing this Philly Tree Plan. It's a 10-year strategic plan to grow the urban forest, guided by environmental justice, community engagement, and sustainability. They put a ton of work into this project, into this strategic plan. They developed an interactive map of the urban tree canopy, so you can see gains and losses in tree canopy from 2008 to 2018 from satellite imagery. And over those 10 years, Philadelphia lost 6% of its tree canopy. And so they, in this strategic plan, established priority areas, areas that have overlapping poverty, health issues, and heat vulnerability, and they've prioritized those areas to try to grow and maintain the urban canopy, particularly in those areas, and invest in people and communities in those areas to care for the existing and the new trees. So their goal in this urban strategic plan is to grow the canopy by 30% over 30 years. And that plan should be coming out sometime this year. So moving forward, I just wanted to kind of tie this work to what I'm doing now in the Office of Sustainability. So as Shai mentioned, this Hunting Park Beat the Heat project was really intended to be a way to shift power and to have community organizations and residents really be the ones moving their plan forward. And we've really taken that to heart and are thinking about that type of engagement for all of our climate resilience work. And so we're calling these place-based initiatives. A place-based initiative or a place-based approach offers a person-centered, bottom-up approach to meet unique needs of people in one given community by using local knowledge to find lasting solutions. So kind of compare that to how government has typically worked, where we tend to operate in silos, where the Parks Department kind of works on parks and trees, and the Streets Department works on paving streets, and then we kind of have this blanket approach to how we deal with things in the city. This place-based approach instead tries to bring all of these resources and all of these city services into one place, but tries to use the local knowledge and the local priorities to make sure that how those services are implemented and felt makes sense for what the community's priorities are. So this place-based approach we think is very effective to responding to multiple challenges. It centers the community perspective, and it's also helpful for attracting different sources of funding. We're not relying just on one department to provide funding for one specific program. We're looking at many different sources of funding to achieve a more holistic vision for the community. And so I'm learning from Shai's work to implement a similar strategy in Eastwick. For those of you who don't know of Eastwick, it's in Southwest Philadelphia. It's the lowest lying community in Philadelphia. It's near the airport, also near John Hines National Wildlife Refuge, which I highly recommend if you haven't been. It's a community that's vulnerable to many different sources of flooding. Historically, it's gotten riverine flooding from where the Darby and the Cobbs Creek converge. But in the future, we anticipate that it will be seeing more tidal storm surge. It will be seeing sea level rise and chronic inundation. There's some streets that we anticipate will be flooded multiple times a year, even when it's sunny, because of sea level rise coming through the sewers. So it's been challenged by flooding in the past, and we think that's going to get worse in the future. And not only flooding, but this community has many other environmental burdens. It's not shown on this map, but there is a landfill here actually near where the creeks converge, which has been a source of contamination and health risk in the community for a very long time. They're close to the airport. They get a lot of air and noise pollution from the airport, as well as 95, which cuts through the community. And it also is a community that has that was subject to a failed urban renewal plan, where thousands of residents were evicted from their homes, and many of them did not get to return. So there's a lot of trauma in the community, and then there's a lot of frustration at what the government has put them through and the lack of action in addressing their challenges. So we started this place-based approach in Eastwick a year ago or so. And what we really aim to do in Eastwick, acknowledging Eastwick's history, the present context, and understanding the residents' vision for a resilient future, we really are aiming towards centering the community's perspective and delivering and sustaining transformation initiatives that align with the community's priorities. Throughout this process, we're strengthening partnership and collaboration. We work very closely with Eastwick organizations as well as our partner agencies. We have been, our first steps were really creating a shared understanding of the issues. There's so many entities involved in Eastwick. The Army Corps is involved, the Water Department, FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency. There have been so many people with their own kind of like agendas and understanding of the issues, and we've been working really hard to try to get us all at the table together to make sure that we're understanding each other's perspectives, and working with residents and our partner agencies to co-develop actions that build a resilient future. So we're working on an application to federal funding to get some of the bipartisan infrastructure funding that's available now, and continuing to try to find other sources of funding to continue to try to implement what the residents feel and see as their vision for the future of Eastwick. So I think, so I guess I'll just end with saying that's been our approach in Eastwick, and our plan is to kind of use this strategy and this framework to try to implement other types of climate resilient strategies in other communities that are facing disproportionate risk and burden from climate resilience. So any other communities that are disproportionately impacted by flooding or heat are kind of the areas that we really want to try to implement this framework in the future. So I will leave it at that and pass it back to Shai. Oh, are we pausing for questions?
Okay, so we're going to do a little activity really quick. We're going to get everybody to take a deep breath. We're here, we're alive. So this is a game that we made that we have done with kids, adults, students, professionals, all types of folks. Basically, the game goes that you must pretend you are Balmy Town. Balmy Town is a place. You are the Balmy Town neighbors in action, and you are coming together as a group to respond to the major heat wave that's coming to your community. So this is your town. This is a map of your town. You split into groups. Usually, that's what I would do. Split you all into groups. I have it just virtual. I've never made it real. So maybe one day. But you have kind of different spots on the map, right? So we see like religious centers, we see like schools, community assistance organizations, we see like police stations, transit, right? These are like core pieces of any town or place. And there's different factors to each of those, right? Like each of those have a different level of vulnerability. They offer something different to the community. Different folks attend those places for different reasons. Then on the left-hand side, you have the game pieces. So there are multiples of each. That's why they're darker. The darker ones, there's multiples, and then the lighter ones, there's just one. You have a very small budget, so I think I came up with like $12 signs or something is the budget. Because in reality, with work like this, when it comes to climate planning from a community standpoint, you're working with a limited budget. So that part is realistic. Kids got very frustrated by that. But I'm gonna shoot it out to you all on the cyberspace here and in person. Where would you move these game pieces and why? Where would you put a heat relief network site? Meaning which location here would serve best as somewhere that people can go walk in and get cool? Which place best would be good for trash cleanup, tree planting? What about a spray ground? Where are you going to go to cool down and put some, spray water around so people can enjoy it together? What about an industry siting? So that's like rallying with your folks to respond to like a landfill or something. Is that going to be a top priority for you? Anyone want to call anything out that comes to mind? Where would they put one of these game pieces, and tell me why? What's your thinking around that? I'll let you think. I think I have another thing. I'm going to click away, but I'll click back. Okay, so then you have news flashes. So as soon as you figure it out and you know where you want to put something, you're going to do it, and then I'm going to throw one of these in your face, okay? So first of all, we'll look at the one on the left. Buildings get hot. We know that, right? There are a lot of dark surfaces. There's usually not trees like surrounding a building, and it might not have AC, right? So that's going to be the first thing on your mind when you're making these decisions. Then you got to remember, you got to prioritize places that are serving folks that are already vulnerable to heat specifically, right? So we've got chronic medical conditions, young folks, older folks, lower income folks, pregnant folks, people who live alone, right? So these are all things that come to mind when you're trying to think about place-based planning. Oops, I cheated. Let's go, let's hear it. Come on, virtual space folks, I want to hear from you. There's a few of you on here, I didn't realize that. Oh, anyone in person?
I would put tree planting and affordable housing.
Oh, Leslie. Go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. Oh yeah, I said I would put the tree planting piece on by over affordable housing and spray grounds in the playground, and then maybe one other spot so people can easily walk to it.
Okay, love it, love it. So tell me about the tree planting in the affordable housing. Why?
Just it's like a really big, looks like a really big section. So, and there's not a lot of trees in that section, so it would just be about filling in some gap there because there's not a lot of green. It doesn't look like there's a lot of green space in that wide area.
Okay, for sure, for sure. So one wrench I'll throw in that is that trees take 10 years to grow, right? So you're gonna spend a bunch of money, a bunch of labor, you're gonna put a tree there, and it's gonna be 10 years down the road. Now it's gonna be great in 10 years. But that's one example, right, of these choices that you have to make, this kind of thinking process you have to go through of like, what's gonna make sense right now? Another example might be this, right? So the community center has a dark roof. It gets really hot in the summer. It's an important resource. This is where neighbors meet to discuss things. The last time they gathered, they set a goal to plant 100 trees within the next year. So while you're responding to one emergency, you have to keep in mind the goal that the community set, that they're asking you to finish, right? So that was great, Leslie. You thought ahead. Anyone else? Want to move one more thing? And why? Here, we'll do it with a, what else do I have here? Nah, I'll skip that one. All right, transit stations. They're really hot. Everyone uses them in this community to get to jobs especially. What are you going to do with the transit station? Anyone online? Anyone in person? A cool roof on the community center. Okay, okay. I'm gonna throw another wrench in it. Let's see if I have it. Hang on, is that the one I did? No, it was the health center. All right, we'll keep it. Anyone else? So the health center, oh wait, what do we have here? The community center has a dark roof and gets hot in the summer without AC. There you go. Yes, so good point. The cool roof would be good. The health center, however, is an opportunity for accessibility for everyone. It's one of those places, okay? It's also like a health center, so that's kind of like life or death, right? But it was really rainy this spring. There was severe flooding, and it actually damaged the air conditioning unit. So there's another example, right? You have a spot, you pick in your mind, you decide this is the one, this is what's important, I know the community will need it, and then something happens, right? And another building is in need or another location. You look like you want to say something or you're just yawning. Absolutely. If you fix the AC units, they can be heat relief network sites. And to fix the AC units, we can do a resource giveaway, right? That's one of the pieces here. You could host one there. Yeah, there you go. All right, anyone? Oh no, I thought I saw someone. Yeah, so that's a little bit of like how this works. Normally, like I said, you split into groups. You all have like 10 minutes. I give you 10 minutes, you know, go, go, go. Can you spend out the money? Why, where, how? I throw a couple of wrenches in there. You have to change your mind, make new choices. And then we'll do another round. And usually, yeah, people get really into it. And it does not take 10 minutes, that's for sure. But yeah, and then these are some of the things that come up. You know, when you're doing things like community planning, there are weird things that happen, things that break, choices that are made. You know, an example here would be like, is that what I put there? Yeah, the industrial site, right? Obviously, it's industrial, it's gross. It's not good for us, it's not good for the planet. But it also is one of the places where most of the community works, right? They work there. So it's not as simple as shut it down, right? Just as an example. I mean, obviously a largely oversimplified one. Oh yeah, that's all the ones I put in there. But yeah, so that's part of the game as well. And then we end and everyone kind of does like a little jam board. So they put together like maybe like in their neighborhood, in their mom's house, in their work, like where would you employ a game like this? Like what would you do with it? Who do you think would, you know, how could you improve it, right? For example. So I think people really enjoy that too. Just like putting some thoughts about like what makes sense in a game like that, how they would use it in their school, in their life, in their neighborhood, in their house, you know. You can really get micro with it. But yeah, thank you for playing the game with me. Sophia, do you want to take over? Should I pause for questions? I'll leave it on the game board. And please, you know, questions for Korin as well. Our vast audience here.
So what about unintended consequences? So you build more resiliency, you address urban heat island and communities. Obviously that makes it better for the residents, but it also makes it more desirable, more attractive.
Yeah.
So how do you, rhetorical question, but how are you all sort of looking at that component of this as well?
Yeah, absolutely. Korin, do you want to respond, or I can respond first?
So thinking about, I guess, what we talked about what you talked about in the second session of gentrification and the unintended consequences that greening might have on property values or gentrification. Is that on?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
We'll leave this
Thanks.
crowd.
Yeah, if you can use the microphone.
Okay. Sorry. Yeah, so, you know, that's a really challenging question because we don't want to not invest in communities for fear of gentrification. Like they deserve to have the same investments, more investments than the communities that are gentrifying. But what we hope the place-based approach really does is make sure that what the community envisions as the future is we do everything in our power to make that happen. And so for some communities like Eastwick, at least from what I've heard, they're not concerned about gentrification. They want to see that investment happening. But this is not on urban heat island. This is on flood resilience. They want their homes protected. They want to be able to stay in their homes. And so we're, at least in Eastwick, we're not even at even close to addressing gentrification because people can't even live in their homes safely. So I think it really depends, but that's what the place-based approach is really helpful for, is hearing the community's concerns and addressing them as much as we can to make sure that what they're kind of flagging as challenges or flagging as like potential threats, that we're kind of keeping a mind towards that and making sure that what we're implementing or what we're proposing or suggesting is in line with what they see for their own community. Best I can say for that.
Yeah, I would also add to that like, you know, one of the things that goes into that, of course, is like affordable housing, like making our housing affordable. So back to that energy burden piece, right? So if we have folks that are like paying higher than average because of things like climate risks, right? Like they're in a really hot neighborhood, their AC bills are absolutely going to be higher because their AC units are going to be working harder. So an example of that would be to like, okay, if we need to preserve housing so that we can reduce, mitigate, or respond to gentrification, whether it's green gentrification or just investment gentrification, which is like wild thought, but then that starts with the home, right? That starts with making sure that it's affordable in general, that we're responding to things that are absolutely related to climate change, like one's energy bills, right? So I think it goes into that for us, definitely, in the work that I've been doing is like, so for example, if we're gonna give away AC units or if we're gonna be planting trees, we also need to be talking to folks about affording their energy bills so they're not getting evicted. So they're not getting in fights with their landlords, and their landlords are going to, you know, therefore evict them, so that they can afford or put money towards like mortgage help or home renovation help, so that they can stay there and keep that community wealth and family wealth. So I think that's one big way that we have been really thinking about it is in that energy burden sphere, because that comes down to home affordability and also housing preservation. And then also it's really important to include community in how these things get designed, right? So like for the heat work, gentrification was talked about nonstop. Like in Hunting Park, they were talking about it all the time, even though it's not necessarily happening that bad there, but it was still a big topic. And they would tell us like, I just need to be able to tell you if you're going to be building something here, I'm going to tell you how to do it because I know how to do it in a way that my neighbors are not going to get kicked out, in a way that you're employing us instead or whatever, right? So I think that also goes into it is like the inclusivity and actually the leadership of a community can actually mitigate gentrification without even technically integrating anti-gentrification measures, because you're starting from a community lens and they're going to tell you like, if you put that there and let that, you know, developer buy this, then we're screwed because they're going to blah, 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 right? Instead, let's, you know, put that in a land trust, and we'd like to see that be a garden, or we'd like to see that be a cooling center, right? So I think just the side of like community planning can be a really, really strong tool in responding to gentrification. Sorry, that was a long-winded answer. It's a complicated topic. It is, yes. Yeah. Yep.
For that. But one of the other things that we have encountered, and so I'm in West Philadelphia, in Jamie Gauthier's district, whether that matters or not, is that we also have had entangled title issues.
Yes.
So having Drexel, for example, working with one of our board members, Michael Froelich, with Community Legal Services, to bring community members there to help them with getting their wills written so that if and when you don't end up with this complication of who is the heir, and then you've got sort of these vacant buildings that can't really be owned or occupied by any of the family members because it's in dispute. So it's a complicated subject matter. I know the city has funding to help homeowners improve their property, but it's way overburdened or too long of a backlog of the people's needs to the funding resources to do things like, you know, making sure that if you've got an air conditioner, is the building airtight so you're not just conditioning your sidewalk instead.
Yep. Yeah, and I think that topic is something we're exploring more and more, and we've been working with, we have this amazing network of neighborhood energy centers in this city, and they're largely positioned in communities that have really, really high both heat and energy burden, also flooding. And these neighborhood energy centers are like really strategically positioned to be the community resource for air tightness solutions in a home. Like, how do we make that affordable? They're going to tell us, they're going to give us their perspective from working with so many community members whose houses are essentially completely unairtight, right? Completely unweatherized, which is so common in a super old city. So that's a really good point too, and I think that goes back to like housing preservation, right? If we can make sure people can stay in their homes, afford them, and be comfortable in them, we can respond to that gentrification issue even with, you know, building out, developing, and investing in communities. So yeah, it's a good point. You obviously have a lot of work experience in it. I'm gonna respond to the chat one.
Oh, you.
I'm really
okay.
just gonna say that like we do not work for Parks and Rec,
That's fair.
and
Should we read the question? I didn't read it.
sure, yeah, I can read it out. So, do you want to make it bigger?
Fine.
I don't know what the name was. I gotta. Shanser, I guess is the first name, responded or asked a question about like tree planting, right? About like what kinds of trees, like why is the city investing in slow growing trees that don't have huge canopy? Like how do we make sure that like big canopy trees are being invested in, trees are continued to be invested in, that we're able to like respond to like how contractors are choosing trees, how they're putting them in, where they're putting them in, that the tree plan gets implemented, a city council driving this, right? So I can say that like on our end, we are definitely always going to be the voice that is pushing for climate solutions, right? So make sure we're using infrastructure, whether that's trees or, you know, gray infrastructure, that's responding to the issues we're facing today. Investing in green infrastructure of all kinds is critical, and we're always pushing that. We're always supporting that. That is really a Parks and Rec question, though. It's very specific. I would say that Parks and Rec has learned a lot about the types of trees that they plant in this city, and they are planting the ones that make the most sense for the city. I can say that. They have done a lot of research behind that and analysis. And it's really interesting. This particular person talks about having an internship or something where they walked around and went through a lot of like zip codes and blocks and talked to folks and stuff. So I think it's true. Like for me, I call it tree trauma. There's a lot of tree trauma in this city, right? First of all, a lot of people have died from trees. That's just like a fact. It's horrible. A lot of people get in major accidents, huge things that we pay for that are so expensive that we leave outside, like a $20,000 car, for example, or more, right? They're really susceptible to things like branches falling. My boyfriend, his windshield broke 3 times in 1 year, okay? Yes. So tree trauma is very real, whether it's things being broken or pain inflicted on us as humans. So I understand that the conversation around trees. Residents in general, trees are a huge topic for them. A lot of residents actually have issue with trees in general, and that's because of like so many poor species were put in this study because, you know, they had no idea it was gonna get so big. But to this person's point, like, are we putting the right species in now? It's a very good point. They say like tree planting is the primary solution for heat. I would definitely push back on that, but I see their point, and possibly also greening an area could involve the planting of indigenous species. Yes, that is what I argue for. Some of these plants have robust root systems that can help with water absorption and mitigate flooding. Are there efforts to implement greening with indigenous plants? Absolutely. Parks and Rec is on it. I will tell you that. They are amazing. So meadows actually have a higher ability to sequester carbon than trees do. Meadows are amazing. They're my favorite thing ever. When I think of PA, I picture meadows. It's so near and dear to my heart. So meadows are a great example of like putting indigenous plants, and Philly has some really cool meadow space. Actually, Philly is really uniquely green for the type of city that we're in. So anyway, a lot of greening info.
I would have. What's that?
Oh, believe me, there's a lot to convey to Illinois.
I was just gonna say, it is like to the complexities, like Philly streets are tiny. There's also like parking challenges, and even watching the water department's green stormwater infrastructure program, which I am so inspired by. It's so challenging to cite green infrastructure on these tiny streets that have so many conflicts.
Oh my God.
So I'll just kind of add to the notion of complexity that there's so much planning and so much discussion and so much weighing that we do, like even just with this like where to put trees in this one exercise, like there's so many decisions to weigh, and it's frustrating because it takes a really long time. But yeah, there's no simple solution most of the time.
Yeah, and we need to be creative when it comes to greening. We need to really think outside the box. You know, what does it look like to green on a teeny tiny dense block where residents want greenery, but they want to lead and guide it. They also want to be able to park. That's true. If we're making a city for people, we also have to listen to them, even if we know cars are bad.
Right.
Right? Go ahead.
The map studying the kind of differences between temperatures, and there's a 20-degree variation from certain parts of the city versus others. Do any of the adjacent counties track the similar data to, and to what extent? Like, I'm sure it's not as much as what you all have done there, but to better get an idea of what the area is, because Philadelphia has is kind of like these microclimates with the heat island in those parts of the cities that were showing up at red, but then you also got the river valleys, and center city is sort of pinched between the two rivers, so how much that is kind of skewing the data from kind of for those specific areas versus kind of the region, the metropolitan area.
Yeah, absolutely. I think in general, like, we need to, you know, quadruple down on our efforts to map heat and really any risk. But heat and flooding in particular, I think flooding is more easy to map, right? It's like, there's water, right? Whereas heat, it's like, there's heat, like, what are you gonna see it? It's not a flame, right? So I think to your point, which I love, which what I'm hearing is that even though we have some neighborhoods that are like really, really, really hot, we also have like cool, like center city, like river areas where you get the breeze and there's trees and there's huge buildings that provide tons of shade and are reflective. So they're bouncing off a lot of that heat. That's probably skewing the overall like estimate of like heat in Philly. So that's what I'm hearing you saying. Okay. So I think it would be so good, like, so back to the Academy of Natural Sciences project that they just did of like mapping that heat, of like driving through and like feeling that. I'm so excited to see that data. But I think in general, like, we really need to do more ground level information, right? Because it's so different for anyone. Someone could be standing somewhere and be like, oh, I'm a little chilly, and someone else could be like, I'm sweating my pants off. You know, like, it's so unique for everyone. So really what we need to have is resources for anyone for what they're feeling, right? And that's, of course, a utopia. But I think we can get there. So yeah, I think like other areas, like we know Lower Marion, they are like really investing in their sustainability work. I don't know if they've mapped their like temperatures yet, but I would love to see like actually the regions outside of Philly. Jersey does a ton of sustainability work. They have a heat map. We could certainly like understand what other areas are experiencing, but overall, really, we just need like a block by block understanding of like what the temperature is, why, what are we feeling, because then you also have to take into account nighttime temperatures, right? So you're hot all day. The ground, the buildings, they're just like absorbing that. They're like eating the heat. And then the nighttime comes and then they just like release it, right? And so you're maybe cooling down and now you feel everything coming back up and the heat is back. So yeah, I think like in general, it'd be so great to have better mapping, to be able to see like where are those unique things and like how can we pull together all the hot ones, make an average and see that, because like it's those numbers that really catalyze policy. Right? It's that data, and then that's what we're trying to do with this work too, is making storytelling and qualitative information as crucial as that type of data, as like numbers on a map, you know. Somebody else said, has there been consideration for vine canopies or vertical like similar to your benches? I mean, I think like so many people, you know, we're just like two humans in a network of like zillions in this city that are working on this. So I'm sure someone has thought of vine canopies and vertical trellises. Have they integrated it in neighborhoods that deserve and need it? No. Are people thinking about it? I'm positive. Should you as architects? Yes.
I imagine there would be a maintenance concern. I imagine that vines and vertical trellises would be a lot harder to make sure that it's like not growing onto something that it shouldn't. So I imagine that could be a concern with vine canopies, but yeah, I think us personally have not been working on it, but again, I'm sure there are.
Yeah, I think something that residents have said to me over and over again is actually bushes. They love big, you know, greenery that is out of the way, right? And what is that? That's bushes. You know, they can grow really tall. They're not necessarily going to climb and attach to your, you know, gutters. They can provide shade if they're placed strategically. They don't necessarily have as large of an evapotranspiration component, but it's something that residents have said, right? So therefore, it's something we must consider and look at, you know? So this is an example of something that maybe you wouldn't think of being like a professional, but then you like live somewhere and experience something and you realize like, oh, that could work, you know? That's why it's so important for decision makers to be locals and for locals to affect decision making and to have like avenues and pathways for that. So we're really working on that as well. Anything else, Sophia? Okay. Well, thanks everyone. We're gonna go sit down.
Great.